everyone, and welcome to a new episode of He's Not Wrong. I'm your host, Chad D. And today's episode is a long one, but trust me when I say it's a good one. I'm joined by scholar and author Sara Moslener to talk about her groundbreaking work on purity culture and its influence on American life. And After Purity, Sara's new book, she traces how white evangelical institutions shaped conversations around gender, sexuality, race, and national identity, and how those teachings impacted the people who grew up inside them, especially women. We get into the stories behind the After Purity project, the political power of white evangelicals, and how purity teachings fueled shame, control, and repression for an entire generation. Sara also shares her own journey from teen purity advocate to researcher and advocate for those harmed by these systems. Our conversation goes so very deep into how purity culture became a political force and what it means for our democracy today. Her new book, After Purity, Race, Sex, and Religion in White Christian America, goes on sale Tuesday, December 9th. So without further ado, I now give you my conversation with Sara. Sara, hi, welcome to He's Not Wrong. How are you today?
I am doing very well. I'm so delighted to be with you, Chad.
I'm so excited that you're finally on the podcast. We received your book several weeks ago, and this is a conversation that is timely. It's a book that is of so much importance right now. And it's called After Purity, Race, Sex, and Religion in White Christian America. So just before we get started, why did you title it After Purity?
Yeah, so I've been studying evangelical purity culture since the early 2000s. And this is my second book on the topic. And when I finished my first book, I was really, which was a much more traditional academic book, which you don't expect to have um, a lot of readership outside of academia, and so I was very surprised that it got public interest, and that people were turning to it. People who'd grown up in purity culture were turning to it as a way to make sense of their experiences,
Yeah.
and I was really delighted with that because I wrote it to make sense of my own experiences, but never expected that other people would read this very traditional academic book as such. And at that point, I decided that were I to have the opportunity to write a second one, it would start with the stories of people who'd grown up and out of purity culture. And so after that experience, how were they making sense of their lives? What questions were they asking about their sexualities, about their religious formation, and also about their racial formation, and so seeing where people ended up after they had been through evangelical purity culture. So that's where After Purity came from.
Did you have any prior experience yourself within that purity culture that you're writing about?
Yes, so I'm about a decade older than most of the people I interviewed. The height of the movement was in the 1990s and early 2000s, and I started working on this topic in 2006, when we were hearing about the Jonas Brothers and their purity
Yes.
rings and all of that. So I was, and I and that's when I was like, oh, this is okay. There is a lot here, right? In terms of the impact it has on US culture at large. And and so um but for me, so I did grow up an evangelical Christian in Western Pennsylvania. And in terms of the purity culture, which it wasn't called then yet, familiar with, um, I was familiar with the Why Wait by Josh McDowell, and he was sort of one of the early people going to evangelical youth events and encouraging people to not have sex before they were married. So, and to me, that, as a teenager, and this is part of what I write about, in the book about my own experiences, was of course, right? This
Yeah.
is, there was no question that that was an essential part of my Christian identity. And so, um, and in fact, in the book, I include a letter that I wrote to my local paper, in response to someone making the claim that, abstinence only education is not effective. And I was very affronted, because I felt like, that embattled Christian who was being told that their beliefs were not valuable and important. Um, and I didn't realize that I was already being recruited into this movement that was barely
Yeah.
starting. But here I was ready to make a public stance, the letter was published. Um, Interestingly enough, I did not remember that at all until after I published my first book on purity culture. And so I knew there was a lot more to my own um,
Mhm.
investment in the movement and these ideals than I had even been aware of as doing the academic work. So yeah, so after purity is part of my own story as well.
We're gonna get into the Jonas Brothers and Miley Cyrus and Disney and those purity rings a little bit later. There's actually an article I saw today where the Jonas Brothers were talking about how they thought it was so weird that people were interested in their sex lives as teenagers and they were on this like purity ring marketing scheme. We're going to talk about it later. I have it written down. Um, but I just think it's interesting that you brought that up because I saw that this morning sitting on the couch drinking my coffee, and that was like one of the first people articles that came up.
Yeah.
Um, and I appreciate you sharing a bit of your background in purity culture. I grew up Catholic. I went to a Catholic school my entire
Hmm.
life from kindergarten to senior year. And so it was abstinence and like sex education, very much so ingrained. Well, lack
Yeah.
of sex education was ingrained
Yeah.
into us as a very little kid. And I distinctly remember being in middle school in seventh grade. We had one class dedicated to sex education, a
Hmm.
50-minute period. And I remember my science teacher saying, okay, this is going to be awkward. We just have to get through it. And for my entire 13 years in that Catholic school, that was the only time that we touched
Hmm.
on the biology of sex, talking
Hmm.
about like, I don't want to say consequences of sex, but having a baby, making a baby, that's the only time we touched it. And any other
Yeah.
time that topic came up as a kid, it was very much rooted in like sex is a sin. Don't have sex out of marriage. It was very much a shameful culture that
Yeah.
was being permeated in that Catholic school community. So I
Yeah.
very much relate to you on that topic. I feel like we could really beat that dead horse if we had
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And
more
there was,
time.
yeah, and there was like True Love Waits was adopted by the American Council of Catholic Bishops.
Mhm.
And True Love Waits, or pardon me, Silver Ring Thing, the other organization that I studied, they would have Bibles to give students, and they had one for Protestants, and they also had a Catholic version.
Mhm.
Um, so there was a lot of that, but it's interesting. And of the interviews, so I did about 65 interviews. Only a couple were Roman Catholic, um, but certainly so much overlap, and um, and between the two traditions.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you talked about that letter that you wrote to your local paper.
Hmm.
Was that the moment when you realized that there was something wrong with this purity culture belief and upbringing, or was it a gradual unraveling over time? Like, did just something flip in you and you're like, wait, this is not right?
Yeah, yeah. So it wasn't until I got to college, and though I went to a Christian college, I got introduced to ideas like feminism and thinking about social inequality around race and gender. And so things started to fall away. And also the way it wasn't until college that I thought about like gay and lesbian
Yeah.
people and sort of seeing then what homophobia looked like and seeing like the gay community show up on my campus and responding to that and realizing like I had completely missed out on this significant um uh the significant conflict that I had somehow been isolated from um as a teenager, and that for me just like shifted everything and said, okay, I can't assume I know the world anymore, that I know
Yeah.
the answers to the big questions. But when it really, so I was a theater major in college. I did a lot of tech work, um and I was in my senior year hired to work at a church event. Um and and I was paid. And so I did it. And it turned out I didn't know what kind of event it was. And it was one of these big churches with the jumbotrons and
Yep.
like a big theater space, which at the time I was like, what is this? Um, but it turned out to be a True Love Waits event. And
Uh-huh.
it just was stunning to me. I mean, first it was, a concert. And then they had a speaker come out, a woman named Gianna Jessen, who I write about in the book, who is a pro-life activist and she tells the story of her mother as a teenager attempting to abort her, and she survived. And so she comes out and tells this story to an audience of junior high school students as a way to encourage them to take a pledge for abstinence. And by that time, so I was 21, and I I just that it just stunned me
Yeah.
that that was kind of the messaging, because it felt so manipulative and
Yeah.
so like just missing the point of what it means to be an adolescent with sort of budding sexual curiosity.
Yeah.
And so that kind of like stuck in my craw for years. And it wasn't until I got to graduate school and was studying religion in a doctoral program that I felt like I could go back there and be like, okay, what was that about?
Hmm.
And that's when I started doing the research. So that for me was really the shift in terms of thinking about purity culture and really seeing it as something incredibly harmful,
Yeah.
even if I wasn't quite yet able to think about my personal experiences within it. But it was just so ubiquitous,
Yeah.
um, especially for people in the 90s and early 2000s, that it was so foundational to being a Christian teenager,
Hmm.
that it almost usurped anything else. And so, yeah, so that's kind of where things got started for me.
I don't think you understand how healing it was reading your book for me, because
Oh,
I was able to see myself in your story and
hmm,
in your experiences. Like, I
yeah.
will talk about it in a few minutes, but like went to the March for Life as well in high school. And there like certain things that you talk about that I did and I felt that and I thought that. I went to Auburn University after
Hmm.
I went to my 13 years of Catholic school.
Yeah.
And granted, yes, very conservative school in conservative Alabama. I'm from Montgomery, Alabama. Um,
Hmm.
to me, going to a public university was like almost like this act of rebellion.
Oh,
Even
yeah.
even though it was Auburn, I was like, I'm gonna be with people that look different than me. I'm gonna experience something so different from what I experienced
Mm-hmm.
in 13 years. I knew in high school that I was gay, but I was so
Mm-hmm.
scared to act on it. Quite literally, I talked about this in a previous episode before with one of my best friends, but I had a religion teacher that would actively say that if you're gay, you're going to hell. Like that's like what was instilled in me at
Mm-hmm.
that age. And so going to Auburn was like an act of resistance against individuals like that.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until then when I was able to find myself and expand my thinking. And I essentially was a closeted gay Republican Catholic kid up until I
Mm-hmm.
was 18. I'm 30 now. So, like, the majority of my life was spent in this space that I just did not fit in. And
Yeah.
reading your book and seeing
Yeah.
that even though my story isn't exactly what you're talking about in the book, but it's very
Mm-hmm.
aligned. And
Yeah.
I appreciate the work that you've done to
Thank you.
to research purity culture, to talk about
Mm-hmm.
Christianity in this way, to talk about how it's permeating our politics and our culture. It's
Yeah.
so important to
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are now there are many people studying purity culture and doing just beautiful work about queer kids, right?
Yeah.
Having to sort of live through that. And some of the stories are so fascinating. Someone I think it was one of my interviewees who told me, like, purity culture was the best closet to have, you
Mm,
know and just sort of the way people would navigate that and have the same, like, okay, well, when I graduate and get to college, then I can really live the life
yeah.
I'm supposed to live, right? Just that sense of, like, just hang on and get through these years. But yeah, there's some really wonderful scholarship coming out that's looking at queerness. And um, and what's really fascinating is the way that purity culture co-opted the language of the gay rights movement.
Mhm.
And in the early '90s, there were Baptist kids who were being interviewed by the Times and talking about, um, you know, wanting virgins to come out of the closet. And so just the way, and they did this in a couple different ways where they, like, co-opted sort of uh, you know the rhetoric of the left and of the sexual revolution, and claimed, like, oh, we're doing the same thing. We deserve to be acknowledged, for
Yeah.
our sexual choices. Just like, because that's what they were seeing when True Love Waits started. And I just saw an interview with Richard Ross, who started True Love Waits in the early '90s. And he was working with a youth group who was watching, you know, gay people come out and being kind of revered for how strong they were, and sort of like how they were just, really kind of standing up for themselves. And they felt like left out.
Mm,
And they started complaining about that. And Richard Ross was like, well, why don't you come out, with your sexual identity of being sexually abstinent? And so, like, that's the origin story of True Love Waits, right? As this sort of anti-queer, right? Well, hey, let's show America, right,
mm,
that there are these straight virgins who are doing it the right way, and to get sort of their cookies for that. So yeah, I mean, the depth of the homophobia, I think, is still has yet to kind of be unearthed.
and I would imagine it's things like that, writings like that, events like that, those beliefs,
Yeah,
it starts and I say small, but a local community, even though it might be a mega
yeah,
church or in a theater that you're at, but it starts small, that
yeah,
that thinking, and then it permeates into your political ideology. And next thing you know, these pastors, these churches, these movements,
yeah,
they're blurring the lines between
yeah.
religious belief and political belief, and
Oh
people
yeah,
can't recognize that
Yeah.
there's a difference between the two. And so
Yeah.
with that,
Yeah.
can you help me break down Christian nationalism and where we see
Yeah.
it permeating in our politics and culture? And I say
Absolutely.
that I have said Christian nationalism is a disease multiple times on my podcast. I'm not wrong about that.
Yeah.
And I, there seems to be a lack of understanding. A lot of people can be taught Christian, what white Christian nationalism looks like, and still fail to recognize it. So that's what
Yeah.
I'm hoping that you can help me break down a
Yeah,
little bit.
yeah, yeah. And I think, I'm a historian within the field of religious studies, and so one thing we need to understand is that, Christian nationalism is an extension of white of European Christianity, right? Of
Mm,
that settler colonial mentality. There's a book called The Cross and the Flag by oh, and I'm totally gonna forget their names. Um, that sort of goes through the history of the United States and says, like, yeah, here we see Christian nationalism all the way through. And so it is very easy to see if you know what to look for. The problem is Christian values have become American values. And so, right, so we've already sort of been conditioned into this world where it's hard to see that distinction. Now, if you talk to people um, uh, who are not Christian, who are immigrants, who are not religious at all, they see it very clearly. Two examples I use with my students are about, um, uh, the inclusion of under God in the Pledge of Allegiance, adding in God we trust to the dollar bill. And so that happened. Those things happened in the context of the Cold War, where the United States needed to um, demonstrate its fidelity to a Christian God as a way of consolidating national strength over and against the godless Soviet Union.
mm.
And there's some really interesting connections to sexuality in there as well, which I get into in my first book. So, but post 1970s, you have the rise of the religious right. And of course, probably one of the best exemplars of Christian nationalism that we have. And of course, this was not, even though the language they used was very much race neutral or even ignored the concept of race, it was very much rooted in resistance to the civil rights movement and wanting to continue the project of the early 20th century in maintaining the United States as a predominantly white place and connecting being white with being Christian. And so this is a real consolidation of power that you see. And so things like, so in the 1980s, you have a couple of widespread social crises, and one of those being the crisis, and I would probably put that in quotes, of teen pregnancy among white teenagers, um, and of course the AIDS epidemic. And so both of those things allowed white evangelicals to articulate the virtues of abstinence only um, beyond their churches, and to say, like, this is what's best, for our young people, for our nation. In fact, the first True Love Waits event in 1994, they would have a series very public events. If you signed a True Love Waits card, you signed two of them. You kept one and you sent the other one back to the organization. And so in 1994, they had collected those cards and they had over um, I think 120,000. And there was an
Wow.
event in Washington, D.C., on the lawn of the National Mall. And they attached those 120,000 cards to tiny little stakes and put them in the lawn of the National Mall as a display of teenage purity. And so from the beginning, right, this was a nationalistic movement. And there are several places where you hear people like Richard Ross and others talk about, right, if our teenagers, pledge to purity, we're going to see revival on a national level. If our teenagers don't pledge to purity, they are going to, right, the United States is going to continue to go into decline. And so this was rhetoric that was not new. It was rhetoric that was picked up from the Cold War, and very similar to what people like Senator McCarthy were saying about gay people, right? If we have gay people in public office, right, working for the federal government, the United States is at risk, right? So there's been this connection between, presumed sexual immorality and the decline of the nation state. And so I don't get into that too much in After Purity. That is more in my first book, but that's right. I mean,
Yeah, that
that
context
is,
is so important. We need to know that history.
yeah, yeah.
And
So,
you brought up the 80s, and you talk about the AIDS epidemic.
yeah.
And you say 80s, and my brain automatically went to, of course, Ronald Reagan. And
Mhm,
I just had Hope Walls, Tim Walls' daughter, on the podcast a week and a
mhm,
half ago.
mhm.
And she made a comment where she was like, whenever something bad happens, all fingers can always point to Ronald Reagan. And I was thinking that was like, it's so crazy how
Yeah,
things from
yeah,
40, 50 years ago can all be pointed to
yeah,
like this consolidation point, and then we're still feeling the effects of it from the
absolutely.
groundwork that they laid all the
Yeah,
way back then today. It's
yeah, yeah.
crazy. How do
Yep.
we push back and respond to the people who refuse to accept that Christian nationalism is becoming very prevalent, more so in
Yeah,
our society?
yeah, yeah. You know, I mean, there's just so much evidence to it, and in the current administration. So um, I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with Project 2025.
Oh,
You know,
yes.
I started studying the Heritage Foundation as soon as I started my dissertation, and saw the ways that they were working to develop research that counteracted academic research on purity pledging, right? Because they were very intent on wanting to get their particular understandings of morality inserted into federal law.
Yeah.
And the biggest, and so that's one thing. So when we think of, so abstinence only education, um, exists, right? I mean, in the 1980s, we didn't have it, and now everyone knows what it is. Many people had it, and it um, would not be so ubiquitous were it not for the Southern Baptist Convention and other evangelical churches that really promoted it as something that wasn't just for them as religious people, but as what was best for the nation.
Yeah.
Um, and then what happens after that is you have then people do research on abstinence only education and determine like it's not scientifically based, right? It has all of these problematic assumptions about gender and sexuality, and and so that's so this became sort of part of the debates over sex education, which had started in the 1970s. And so yeah, so I mean, and it was the religious right, even though The moral majority didn't last very long as an organization.
Mhm.
The rightward shift of the federal government and state governments, right, was well in place,
Yeah.
and of course we're seeing the sort of monstrosity that was created because of that right now, and not just around sex education. I've not been able to pay attention to what's happening in sex education now. I just I know some people who do work in sex education, but I think there's just no funding, there's no resources, and there's no
Hmm.
consistency.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's at all levels. It's at all levels. It's
Yeah.
the removal of funds to
Mhm.
changing entire curriculums in states to remove sex education from curriculums
Yep.
to, as you know, the book bans. In
Yep.
places like Florida, we had Rob Sanders on the podcast, who's the number one children's book author who is banned in America, and
Okay.
he wrote books called Pride and children's books that
Yep.
introduced them to figures like Harvey Milk. And
Hmm.
I mean, they're coming after him. It's not stopping his work, but he even on
Yeah.
that episode read letters from kids who wrote him. They were in third grade and
Mhm.
they were like, "Thank you so much for this book. Like, I feel understood." And it's the
Yeah.
fact that a kid can express that.
Yeah.
Anywho, that
Yep.
a tangent I can go on, but
Yep.
um, I want to take it back to the removal
Hmm.
of like education and science in our public
Hmm.
policy, and really putting religious belief and opinion
Yeah. Yeah.
as the law of the land. Um,
Hmm.
you talked about in the book, we talked about it a little bit earlier. You went to the March for Life. I
Hmm.
went to the March for Life in high school. It was branded as like this big trip to Washington, D.C. And I loved politics and government and DC. And so
Hmm.
I really
Hmm.
wanted to go because I was like, oh, exercising
Yeah.
your First Amendment right and going to DC. Of
Mhm.
course I
Oh,
want
it
to
was
go.
thrilling. It was
Yeah.
thrilling. Yeah.
And you said in the book, and again, I felt like words straight out of my mouth. It felt like a moment to be a part of something big and important. And if there's one thing that the March for Life and the Catholic Church has done well, it's it's the branding of their mission towards youth and using them, in my
Mhm.
opinion, as political pawns. They always wanted to talk about abortion being evil, but they never talked about like why a woman might be facing that decision in the first place. It was very surface level, never went into the why, into that gray area.
Yeah.
And like they never gave us medical facts or real life context
Yeah.
to the point where it was just so like looking back, it was so obviously skewed. Why do movements like that rely
Yeah.
so heavily on controlling the narrative rather than presenting full context and full truth and full
Yeah.
fact?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good question. And what I see with the pro-life movement is again a response to the civil rights movement. And I think it gets into the argument I'm making in After Purity about how the United States, nationalistic ideologies in the United States depend on myths of innocence. And so the civil rights movement did so much, and sort of the different movements that came after it, right? The American Indian movement, the gay rights movement. So all of these that are saying like, hey, there are so many people who are still on the fringe, right? And
Yeah.
trying to sort of change the center. Um, and the response to that, um, and it worked, and it was incredibly effective, right? We changed immigration laws, we changed laws around birth control, um, and eventually laws around gay marriage, and and what I see the pro life movement as is using those same strategies,
Yeah.
right? Because the civil rights movement was able to lift up groups that had been marginalized, that needed defending, that
Yeah.
demanded the rights, right? That were, that had been denied the rights of being in the United States. Um, so the pro-life rhetoric is so similar to that, but the figure they're standing up for is the unborn child, right? As they call it, right? The unborn. And so it doesn't work very well because you get all this like messy, like science stuff,
Yeah.
right? And all these philosophical questions about, well, when does life begin? And so I see the pro-life movement as having created this innocence myth, right? Where the ultimate innocent
Mm.
is the unborn, and that by standing up for that they can maintain their own innocence, um, and because they're not able to jump on board these other movements,
Yeah.
but they've created their own kind of civil rights movement so that they can, right, so to give them a kind of leverage,
Yeah.
um, in the political system. So that's how I've come to understand the pro-life movement, that it was very much shaped according to what worked in the civil rights movement and all of those movements that came after. And so it's immediately already then um, uh, tagged on to the ideas of the United States and who's a citizen. That is, who's a person, right? That's what civil rights is all about. Who's a person? And so they're making the personhood argument about a fetus. Um, so and so that I think, and for me, growing up and sort of being like, okay, this is the thing that you can stand up for, that you can represent the voiceless, right, the powerless, um, and it really worked, and right, and we know the history of the pro-life movement. If you've ever sort of, there's been work by the historian Randall Balmer who uh, has written about this, that when the moral majority was forming, it was at a time when white Southern institutions were being challenged for not desegregating. And they knew that wasn't a battle they could win, and they didn't, but they needed to figure out, but they knew there were a lot of white evangelicals that were really angry. So they
Yeah.
said, what is another way that we can make them into a voting bloc?
Mm.
Um, and they decided on abortion. And so, um, and so abortion became um, this this symbol of all the things that were wrong in the United States, and a way to push back against um, increased women's rights,
Yeah.
and all of those things. So yeah, so there were several things. Sorry, this is my historian's brain is just like, what are all the things that are happening here? Um, and But yeah, so it was um, so so yeah, the pro-life movement was, very much and still is a nationalistic movement, in that it's making claims about personhood, which are ultimately in the United States claims about who gets to be a citizen, who should be a citizen in the United States.
I've always said, and I fully believe, that children should be off limits from any form of indoctrination. I
Mm,
I think when you make that claim, both
yeah,
sides of the aisle would agree with it. But it
yeah, yeah,
seems that the right side of the aisle is all words, no action when it comes to that statement. I say
right.
that because purity culture seems, in the truest sense, to be the indoctrination of children. It's not
Yeah,
rooted in care, it's very much rooted in an agenda. And as you talked about a little bit about the unborn, like a child is just simply the easiest to shape and control. Can you hear my
Yeah,
cat through the
I
microphone?
can. Yeah, yeah, that's great.
Lord. So what I'm curious is what impact does the early indoctrination have on a child's long-term emotional and moral development? And this also is
Yeah,
going to lead into that Jonas Brothers and Miley Cyrus comment that I wanted to make. So
yeah.
just a little foreshadowing.
Yeah, so I interviewed over 60 people who grew up in and out of purity culture, and some had sort of early memories where they were told that their clothes were not appropriate, right? Before they even could understand why, right? So lots of
Yeah.
lessons about modesty. I interviewed someone whose father, she was going to go to the beach or the pool and had her bathing suit on, and her father was horrified because her body was growing and changing, and he took her bathing suit and cut it up. So those kinds of messages of like that your body is something dangerous, right? That can happen very early on. And it, the overwhelming theme of my interviews was the theme of disembodiment, right? That
Hmm.
you need to resist the needs of your body, the prompts of your body, right? And that's right, and that's how you are formed as a Christian believer, that if you can sort of resist those things. And that's so much of what people's stories are about, that when you resist what are bodily urges, just the harm that can
Yeah.
happen. And that's anywhere from people just feeling very concerned about the clothes they're wearing, and to controlling their bodies through eating disorders, through developing fears of sexuality, um, and to the point where even when they've gotten to a point in their life when they say, okay, I don't believe that anymore, right? Their bodies still carry those expectations that, hey, this is
Yeah.
bad and wrong. Um, so yeah, it can set in at a very early age, and the groups that I have studied were intentional about, they wanted to reach young people at the age of 11, right? So pre-pubescent, so that they can understand these things before they start, feeling all the feelings that you do.
One thing that I did not realize until reading your book was how deeply rooted the influence of the Southern Baptist Convention
Yeah,
was in society and specifically in policy making
yeah,
from all angles.
yeah.
And now, as a 30-year-old, having worked in politics, I understand how these outside groups can influence people's thinking and agendas and
Mm,
policy and all the avenues that they can take to get there. But I never once thought that seeing all those like infomercial spots on Disney or the articles about Miley Cyrus and the Jonas Brothers, as we were talking about, were impurity rings, and the big push coming from them to get that younger audience on the Disney Channel to be
yeah,
abstinent and to
yeah,
air quotes for the listeners right now, to stay pure
yeah.
and innocent. I never knew or even thought that it would be an outside group
Hmm.
influencing an organization like Disney to get that propagandist messaging out there.
Yeah,
How did these large institutions like the Southern Baptist Convention
yeah,
gain so much cultural authority? And why
yeah.
is that influence still holding today?
Yeah, yeah. So as with like the moral majority, right, when there was this rightward shift in the 1980s, um, the Southern Baptist Convention also shifted. Prior to the end of the 1970s, the SBC was pretty mainstream. They didn't have policies, in particular about abortion. And I've talked to people who grew up, SBC in the 60s and 70s, and said, yeah, it was we were pretty mainstream. But in the late 1970s, you had what historians call the fundamentalist takeover.
Mm.
And what they did, one of the things they did was they kicked women throughout the 1980s was they got rid of women in leadership, in churches and also in Baptist schools. And so there was this rightward shift. There was this emphasis on, right, on sexuality, on the family. And so they became a totally different organization. And so then one that was deeply homophobic and of course used the language of family as a way to promote what were really kind of awful beliefs. And but what's interesting, so in the 1990s, early 1990s, um, Disney and ABC, so Disney, I can't remember, one is the parent corporation of the
Yeah,
other. Right.
Disney is the parent corporation for ABC.
ABC, yeah. So in the early 90s, was it 92, 93 is when Ellen DeGeneres came out on her
Yeah.
sitcom, right? Huge watershed moments. Disney at the time was also having days for gay families in the early 1990s. And so the SBC had very much, right, they'd consolidated their power by shifting to the right, and they had um, enough influence that they threatened a boycott, and so enough that and they never went through with it, but there was, right, but Disney started losing money and there was a lot of stuff happening, and so Disney found themselves having to get on the right side of the SBC. And so, unless, and a decade and a few years later, all the Disney kids are wearing purity rings.
Oh my God. If a church organization has the influence and the power to take control of a media company like Disney, tax them.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Tax them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and it was, yeah, it was, this is something um, that I've just been piecing together. And of course, I haven't seen the contracts of any of those people, but people have spoken out about it, about the purity culture at Disney, especially for, right, all these young pop stars
Hmm.
who would go on to greatness, um, and kind of their experiences of feeling pressured into that. Some spoke positively about it. There was one person, and I'm gonna completely forget her name, who was sexually assaulted as a teenager while she worked for
Hmm.
Disney, and couldn't say anything about it because of sort of the purity culture that was there. So
Yeah.
yeah, so there's some, I hope someone who might have some more connections at Disney does some more digging on that. But it's really fascinating to see then, right, that it became this cultural phenomenon
Yeah.
because as those Disney kids grew up and had these humongous careers, that remained part of their brand. Yeah.
I'm at a loss for words. That is absolutely insane that
Yeah.
the SBC
Yeah.
had that
Yeah.
much influence.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
S-
And I know you want to bring up the Jonas Brothers, and my understanding, so they are actually, their dad is a pastor. And so I don't know if for them it was through Disney per se, um, or if it was just because, like, hey, this is what we're supposed to do. Um, but I did hear, I think one of them said, like, yeah, we went to Disneyland to get our purity rings. And I was like, wait, what? So you can get Disney purity rings? So anyway, so that's another rabbit hole. Someone needs to go
I'm
down.
I'm
Yeah,
gonna we're gonna have to have like a
yeah,
live, like go on Facebook Live together someday soon and just like
yeah,
do a big research session on
yeah.
this topic.
Yes, yes. So,
We're not
I
even
know
asking if
that's
you want to come back on. I'm going ahead and
right.
telling you to come
Yeah,
back on,
let's
and we're
just
we're
do it.
deep we're deep
How
diving.
do we bring in the Jonas Brothers? Like
Yeah.
I mean, I knew like when I started getting interviewed and like I've been interviewed about Britney Spears and the Jonas, and I was just like, I had no idea. That was not, you don't get a PhD in religion, so you can become sort of an expert on
But
teen
what
pop
what
stars.
an yeah, what an interesting PhD that would be though.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
As we discussed, there is a massive movement to get youth involved in far right politics, not just politically engaged, but
Hmm.
truly indoctrinated, as we talked about, in that culture of white Christian nationalism. And I specifically see it with the Turning Point USA. They have their homeschooling curriculum, and then they
Yep.
have their high school
Hmm.
Turning Point chapters, and
Hmm.
it's clearly a
Yeah.
coordinated effort to to get them while they're young. And I want to
Yeah.
say that in air quotes because I don't agree with that statement, but that seems to be what their approach is.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is a fairly specific question, and I hope that
Hmm.
I'm doing it right based on my own research, reading your
Yeah.
book. But how did purity culture teach to white teenage men, specifically white teenage boys,
Hmm.
to see themselves as morally superior? And then how did that feed into the political project that we see
Yeah.
happening right now? Because in your
Yeah.
book, you did draw that through line that through purity culture, through white Christian nationalism, there is a level of racism that is perpetuated through this
Hmm.
Christian, again, air quotes, because I don't believe it's
Right.
true Christianity, but through this Christian culture.
Hmm. Hmm. And also along with that, a deep commitment to misogyny. And
Yeah.
so I think that's where then, boys and young men learn to feel superior.
Mm,
Right. The idea of gender complementarianism and that, which goes all the way back to the 19th century, but this idea that men and women, boys and girls have very different roles,
yeah.
and have been designed, by God to fulfill those different roles. And we've been seeing, I can't remember who the football player was, but we certainly see this, in Erica Kirk's rhetoric now that like, oh, that girls, need to understand the most important thing they can do is marry and have children.
Hmm.
And I mean, and that's a really like that's just and then we have the trad wives, right, who are really, at the front of that as well. So this sort of valorization and glamorization of traditional femininity, um, which assumes female subservience. And so, if that's what you're promoting, right, the men and boys, right, don't have to do much else except, kind of accept that and promote that as true, to be able to maintain kind of, their position in the gender hierarchy. And so that's what we're seeing as we look at, groups like Turning Point and the work that they're doing is that they are using, right. And I mean, and the thing about gender is, as much as they argue that like that gender is something that's natural, that's God given,
Yeah.
right, the same as sexuality, right, and it's a binary, right, so and all these things, they have to do all this work to socialize people into heterosexuality, into masculinity, into femininity, and make sure that young people are growing up into their proper roles right
Yeah.
now. If they are supposedly natural, like why do we have to do all that work,
Yeah.
right? Why is there such a fear of transness? um, that somehow if we can just pretend trans people don't exist, that that's going to keep them from, from existing.
Yeah.
It's just, and that's again, and this is part of the myths of innocence, right? The kind of um, cognitive dissonance that people have to create in order to make these ideologies seem relevant and seem common sense. Like, well, this is what the Bible says. Well, this is
Yeah.
what's best for the United States, and so on. And now I forget your question, which always means I should stop talking.
It is all I believe you pretty much answered it. And I
Oh,
like what
good.
you I like what you brought up because you talked a bit about that in your book when you were 6 and you and
Yeah,
your friend were in the basement of the school and there's this the whole underwear with the boys situation, and I'll let
yeah,
people go get the book and read that
yeah,
for more
yeah, yeah,
context. But there's this whole culture of shame, and like it's always the woman's fault.
yep,
It's and that was put on you as a kid.
yeah,
It's not the guy's fault for doing
yeah,
something inappropriate. It's yours,
yeah,
and I mean it's just crazy how that level of like indoctrination, of shame, of guilt,
yeah,
of blame is put on you
yeah.
so young.
Very early on, right? And it took me, right, decades to retell that story to myself. That's why I wanted to write about that because I remembered like I was just playing with my friend, right? But I had this whole
Yeah.
memory of myself being, you know, 6 years old and needing the attention of boys, because that's how that whole incident was framed for me at the time. Um, this is one of the benefits of getting older. Like I'm over 50 now, and like I've learned that like you start seeing your life in such different ways, and like
Yeah.
different pieces of truth come up, and you're like, wait a minute. That's not what I thought all these years. Yeah, I mean, so much shame, and so much from what I would call now like enforced heterosexuality,
Yeah.
right? Which include and mandatory heterosexuality, and not just in terms of, yes, your gender identity, your sexual identity, but also in terms of like just your sense of self and right of being partnered in a particular way, of sort of falling into these scripts of being
Mhm.
married and having children, and that is right. That is how you be a good Christian. That's how you be a good citizen, right? And we see. I don't know. Have you seen the memes of like of like the single woman memes
Yes.
of like the unhappy we've been hearing a lot of this rhetoric too of like of
Yes.
the childless cat lady, that's it.
Mhm.
um and which are real, and at first I was like, is this just liberals trolling? Like, are conservatives really saying this? Like, do they really think that those of us who are not married and don't have children are so miserable and degraded?
You know what? That might have been a trolley question last year,
Yeah,
but they believe it
yeah,
after this
yeah,
year. We have our
yeah,
answer.
yeah. Or at least they're using it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the thing about, the current political climate is it's hard to know what are deeply held beliefs and what is being used as a tool of power,
Mm.
right? And so I, yeah, so I don't, but of course, but on the other hand, if you're impacted by it, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
If people believe it or not as individuals, if that's what they are enshrining in public policy, then yeah, that's it.
You talked a little bit about Erica Kirk earlier, and we're going to
Mhm.
dive into that a little bit, but I think there's a perfect segue with what you were just talking about with it was a question like, do they actually believe that? And
Yeah,
then
yeah,
this year, I mean, to me, it seems like they are, but they're even if they are not. they are
Mhm.
using it to their advantage.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Erica Kirk recently made comments about women in marriage during, I believe it was a town hall with the New York Times. I'm just going to read a little excerpt
Mhm.
from that headline and article
Right.
because she said, let me pull up the quote here. She called it ironic that so many women voted for Zoran Mamdani in the New York City mayoral election. She noted that career-driven women in New York almost look to the government as a form of replacement for family, expressing concern that this reliance could lead young women in the city to put off having a family or marriage. What is your response to her saying that? And then to the people like Barry Weiss who are actively platforming her by having her do a town hall on
Yep.
live on CBS during
Yeah.
prime time. What is your response to her and to people like
Yeah.
Barry Weiss who are spreading these ideologies
Yeah.
through
Yeah.
mainstream media?
Yeah. I gotta say, that is the most articulate way I have ever heard that um, said. I mean, because that is exactly their arguments.
Mm,
And it is everything to do, and it's using these ideologies of gender and gender traditionalism as a way to make arguments about what is the United States, who gets to be a citizen,
yeah.
right? Because who depends on the federal government, right? For survival, for subsistence, right? It's poor people, it's people who are disabled, it's a lot of people of color, right? And so it's a way of saying, like, if you can't be self-sufficient, right? And this is, I write about this at the end of my book in terms of what I learned from being in the pro-life movement, right? That you need to be self-sufficient. And the way you become self-sufficient is by getting married and having a family, right? And being in a certain economic strata. And if you're having children out of wedlock, you're going to become dependent on the federal government, and therefore you're a problem, right? So
Yeah.
so this has been part of, right? This is Reagan, right? Going
Yeah.
back to Reagan, and it's making a claim about, well, who then, right? Who then has the right to citizenship, right? And if you need to depend on the federal government, then you're not the right kind of citizen. And ooh, oh, sorry, this really gets me, right?
No,
And it's,
it's
yep,
valid because they use
yep,
government assistance as a way to
yep.
create a system of second class citizens.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is why when I talk about the pro life movement, we also have to talk about the myth of the welfare queen, right?
Mm,
Because that was so much, at least in my growing up, this idea that, oh, there are women who are having babies. Again, this is Reagan, right? Who are
yeah.
having babies just so they can get lots of money. And it's always a poor woman of color. And I recommend everyone sort of read the book about the myth of the welfare queen, and that it's completely false, right? Completely fabricated, again, as a way to designate, like, who are the people who don't deserve the rights of citizenship.
Yeah.
And so that is right. That is the work that's happening, right? That is Project 2025, right? And so you see this gender ideology about, well, this is what women should do. Women who want to be, who want to be successful as women, who want to be cared for, who want to be able to care for their children, right? You have to sort of get aligned with this if you want to be the kind, if you want to be a woman. Um, and so it's really, but man, yeah, that language is just, if that came from her, and I don't know who her people are, but if that is something that she wrote, then man, we're screwed, because she is a billion times smarter than her husband
Uh,
was.
110%.
You know, and yeah,
I fully agree with that. Like,
yeah,
give credit where credit is due. She
yeah,
is
yeah,
smart. She has a political savvy about her that I don't
yeah,
even think
yeah,
Charlie let on.
yeah.
it's crazy. So that
Yeah.
was on the New York Times. That was a town hall that she did. She's doing the Barry Weiss town hall on CBS primetime. Fox News is about to have her on, I believe, with at some point within the
Yeah.
next 2 weeks. She will be on
Yeah.
6 times in 1 week because she
Wow.
is promoting the book that Charlie was going to come out with. They're still
Okay.
going to publish it. And so she's doing an entire
Yeah.
book tour and
Yep.
press
Yep.
junket for that.
Yeah. And I went like I just and it makes me feel so defeated, right? After, I've been studying this stuff for so long. It feels so familiar to me. But I just, especially, I mean, since the inauguration, I've just not been able to keep up. Like I'm in self-preservation mode.
You
And I
kind
know
of have
there,
to be.
yeah, yeah. And I was like, I wish I could follow her and hear what she's saying. And but I just yeah, it would not be good for me. But I know many people like yourself and like other colleagues who are very much so keeping up with it. But yeah, the rhetoric around womanhood um, is is so regressive, and yet, and this is what conservatives are good at, is sort of presenting something that's very regressive as forward thinking.
Yes.
And it's so fascinating. But in one of the things I've been thinking and talking about a lot, and I don't think Erica Kirk falls into this yet. It'll be interesting to see, is the whole Mar-a-Lago face phenomenon and how the women in Trump's orbit are all looking similar in terms of the plastic surgery they've had done. And so this was something I was reading up on, and when you listen to even plastic surgeons talk, they say, most people when they, especially a plastic surgery on their face, they want to look natural, but these choices are unnatural, and so I was trying to think about that in terms of the roles that women play in
Mm,
authoritarianism and how their role is to show that they are all in, right? Because they can maintain their status if they are willing to show, right, that they are all in and willing to play their role. And so, what a better way to do that than to augment your features
and
so
what
that, yeah, to look like a sex doll.
and
Someone mentioned that the other day. Like, yeah, it is. They look like the features of a sex doll.
but there's so much truth to what you just said because in authoritarianism you see a lot of oligarchs who step into their power and their prime.
Yeah.
And these women, I guess also being able to physically show that they have money, they have wealth,
Yep.
it makes
Yep.
them fit into that space that they want acceptance in. And
Yep.
it fits that whole authoritarianism, oligarch
Yeah.
mentality. That
Yep.
makes so much sense. I've not thought about it in that way before.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to talk about accountability in the evangelical Christian community.
Yeah.
We talked about this a little bit before with the shame that is put on women
Hmm.
at a very young age because it's always the woman's fault.
Hmm.
And this idea that it's never the man's fault, the blame is never put on the man is it starts at such a young age. And for example, here in Alabama, there's a megachurch called the Church of the Highlands, and
Mm.
they just built a multi-million dollar retreat for church leadership, and it's in the middle of nowhere. You cannot access it unless you are in with that leadership.
Mm.
It's essentially by the looks of it, it's essentially like a vacation lodge where
Hmm.
pastors can go to meet and hunt and do men things, but they're selling it to the members and the public as a rehabilitation center where pastors accused of serious misconduct can go and be fixed and return to leading their congregation and their church and saying that they've been saved, they've worked on themselves, they went to this rehabilitation center. And there's several pastors who have been reinstalled in their churches in the South because they did go to this vacation lodge. This is by no means a solution. It doesn't even resemble one.
Mm-mm.
But the problem will continue to escalate until people recognize that abusive culture within evangelical spaces
Yeah.
is addressed at the teaching level, not at the leadership
Yeah.
level, but at that fundamental basic teaching level. And in the
Yeah.
book, you describe a similar story about abuse involving Lee Chatfield.
Hmm.
So I'm curious if you can go a bit deeper into how the
Yeah.
lack of accountability becomes normalized, leads to
Yeah.
abuse, and why congregations continue to
Yeah.
accept it when the truth is right there in front of us.
Yeah. 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 What was the name? So, what was the name of the church?
The Church of the Highlands.
Church of the Highlands. So, yeah, thank you so much for that question. So, I have been for the last 5 years part of a project with several other colleagues studying religion and sexual abuse. And the first thing I think about when you tell me about this retreat center, right, the place where the clergy can go, and
Yeah.
is there are so many parallels to what's happened in the Catholic Church,
Yep.
right, where priests are sent, right. In fact, there was an entire order created for priests to go and spend time and sort of, deal with their stuff and then be, reintegrated. So there's some really and I just came back from a conference where I went with a group of scholars to one of the largest collections of the largest archive on clergy sex abuse in the Catholic Church. And so we were having these conversations about our research and about, right, and these efforts of people and the way then that, and in some cases, right, churches will, right, support that return, will want to believe that the change has happened, right, because they're able to, and I think this gets to your question, right? They're able to use kind of the hooks of the Christian narrative of sin and redemption, right? In a way that allows them to maintain, right, the power systems that are in place, and so and again, this is what I mean by a myth of innocence, right? That the narrative of falling into sin and, being transformed and redeemed gets exploited for all sorts of reasons, in order to make sure the community, the church institution itself
Mm.
is preserved. Because what people don't want to understand, right? People want this to be about the bad apple, right? And if the bad apple, right, can be redeemed, right, then everything is okay. But what they're not seeing are the ways that teachings about sexuality or absence of teaching about sexuality, that gender complementarianism that creates these strict gender roles, that these all contribute to creating cultures of abuse where, where predators, can flourish as
Yeah.
predators. And so they're not asking the theological questions that need to be asked. Like, why is this happening here? Like, what is it about what we are teaching, about what we are assuming is biblical,
Yeah.
that is allowing this to happen, right? And so then you can say, okay, well, here's this individual who did these wrong things, and they can show penance, they can go to this place and do whatever it is they need to do, and then be welcome back, um, right? But to use the apple metaphor, but like the roots of the tree are rotten.
Yeah.
So like you're not getting to the problem. And that's where, like the SBC and so many other churches just continue to fail because they're not willing to question their theological assumptions,
And it
especially
almost,
around gender and sexuality.
yeah. And it almost feels like creating these spaces to
Mhm.
allow pastors to, again, air quotes, be like recover from
Yes.
really awful things
Yeah.
is almost like a test for how loyal is this congregation?
Right.
Are they are they going to ask the questions? Or are they going to blindly go along with it? And if they
Hmm.
blindly go along
Hmm.
with it, then they can continue to push that envelope the
Yeah.
next time
Yeah.
they want to spend
Yeah.
$4.3 million on a recovery center. And by the way, I did, when you were speaking, I got the link and I just emailed it to you. So you
Thank
have an
you.
article in your inbox on that.
Thank you. Thank you
Yep.
very much. Yeah. Um, the it's interesting, well, and what I hear and as you're talking is the language of Darvo. Do you know this? And I'm trying to remember which who it was. I can't remember the person who coined it. I do write about this in the book, but it's a strategy of abusers to write to divert and shift culpability onto the victim, right? You reverse for victim and offender. And so when we're talking about, like, oh, it's the perpetrator that needs healing.
Yep.
Okay, well, where's the $1 million thing for the survivors of abuse, right? Who most likely have left the church, who have been ostracized from the church, especially if, if they've gone public or come forward, right? So, but here it's like, oh, it's the people in power, right? It's these ones who are, and purity culture teaches us, right, that men cannot, like, are just naturally sexually insatiable. And so this is just, you know, something that they need to get under control.
Yeah.
But they're not stepping outside of God's design for sexuality, in doing this. They are abusing it, but they just need to be pulled back a little bit to be back in line, right?
Yeah.
So it's, whew, yeah, the mental gymnastics are exhausting there.
No, it,
Yeah,
my brain, it feels fried after the mental gymnastics on that one, because it
yeah,
just goes it goes so deep. It goes so deep. It's
yeah,
everywhere. How do you get people
yeah,
to wake up to realize that? But
yeah.
that's a topic and a conversation for another day.
Hmm.
Sarah, my final question for you: what is it that you are not wrong about?
So I have two things. The
Let's hear
first
it.
is I am not wrong. I and many, many others am not wrong about the fact that ketchup should never go on a hot dog. In the Midwest, that's a big. I don't know how in the South you feel about your hot dogs, but yeah, I spent enough time in Chicago to know. That is, I am not wrong
Before
about
you
that.
give number two, but you
Yep.
have to, I'm not letting that go. You have to justify and back that up. Uh
So,
huh.
yeah. And so people smarter than me, so actual academics in Chicago wrote a book on hot dogs in Chicago, and their argument was like it's okay if you're under 12, right? But yeah, ketchup on a hot dog is a sign of immaturity and a lack of sophistication. So for
That
those in
makes
Chicago,
Okay, so
yeah,
that makes so much sense why Barack Obama does not like ketchup. I think he said on Michelle Obama's podcast,
yeah,
literally exactly that. If you're using ketchup and
right, yeah,
and you're above the age of 12, like he
yeah.
doesn't trust you.
It is right. I will say it's okay for potatoes, right? French fries, tater tots, fried potatoes. But on a hot dog, it just, yeah, yeah. And I don't know if there's like a chemical argument. Like, is it something about the flavors? And I
Sure.
remember the taste of ketchup on hot dogs. And now I just, yeah. And I think yeah. So, and I go to the mat on this many times. And I'm sure this is what you will get comments on,
I
but I'm not
listen.
backing down. Yeah.
We've been speaking for the better part of an hour and a half now, and I
Yeah.
this might be the first clip that I post on social media because I'm gonna need to know where people lie on this.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
What's number two?
The other thing gets back to my argument and after purity, and that is I am not wrong about um, the argument that evangelical purity culture was not just about how we were formed in terms of our sex and gender. It was also about how we were formed in our racial identities. especially for white people.
And on that note, Sarah, I have to say, you are not wrong. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
your time so much. I know we went over the allotted hour that we had, but I'm so grateful for your time, for your work, your book, everything that you are doing to spread this information. I am so grateful to you for. I very much enjoyed our conversation today, and I hope that you will come back to He's Not Wrong here in the near future and be our guest again.
I would be happy to. Thank you so much for a great conversation.
Thank you, Sarah.